Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we can begin our study of the Book of Chronicles, Sefer Divrei Hayomim, which is in the modern setting. It's divided into two parts, Chronicles 1 and Chronicles 2, but of course it is originally all just one book. It is in most modern printings of Tanakh. It is the final book of Tanakh. It is the last book, but that is not traditionally how it's always been. The Gemara has it in a different order. Some of the various codexes, such as the Aleppo Codex, also has it in a different order. But regardless, for us in this podcast, because I haven't been going in the order of the modern printing, it's not the last book, but it is the last narrative history style book that we're going to study together, because after this all we have left is the books of Mishlei, Proverbs, Tehillim, Psalms, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs, and Eichal, Lamentations. That will be all that we have left together to study in this podcast. But regardless, let's begin the Book of Chronicles. Now, the Book of Chronicles, it is pretty clear from its writing and the context that it was written in the early Second Temple period days. Just to remind you, it was during this time was the time when portions of the Jewish people that were in exile, in the Babylonian exile, that had been exiled to Babylon after the destruction of the First Temple, were allowed to begin returning by Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia. During the period of exile, the Persian kingdom ascended and conquered the Babylonian kingdom, so it was the Persian kingdom that dominated the Middle East for the next several centuries. And during this time period, many of the Jews left exile and returned to rebuild the Second Temple and to rebuild their presence in the land of Israel. During this time period, most of the Jews, though, stayed in exile, not sure if this project was going to work and succeed. And the time was it was a time of uncertainty, a time where the initial people were very dedicated to building the dream, but there was a lot of emotional letdown and problems with morale because people saw adversity around them. People lost enthusiasm for the project, and when they did not see the miraculous occurrences that accompanied the first arrival in the land of Israel under Joshua many centuries earlier, and they were kind of depressed. So if you look at this book, remember the kind of mindset that we were in when we studied the works of the prophets who prophesied during this time period, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, which we studied those books together. I'd recommend, if you haven't studied them with us, go back to those podcasts to study them. And of course, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which also chronicle this time period. The tradition has it, and from the Talmud, that the writer of this book was Ezra himself. There's no reason not to trust the tradition of the rabbis here, because it certainly seems to have been written in this time period. This is very important, not just to know who wrote it, which is important in and of itself, of course, but it's important because we need to understand why it's being written. And in order to discuss this, I want to point out something that we all recognize when you tell a story and a narrative, especially a historical narrative. Most of the time when people tell a historical narrative, right? Historical narrative means the way you tell the story of history. Now, two different people can tell the story of a particular event or time period in history, and they can tell two very different stories, even in cases where they are both technically correct in terms of the events that occurred. They can each report the same events, the same numbers, the same statistics. Or maybe they can quote different statistics, both of which are true, but might emphasize different aspects of what happened. So when you tell a story of history, there's a purpose to it, right? You're trying to tell a story in order to achieve a certain result. Ezra's attempt, and we'll see this throughout the book of Divrei Hayamim here, it has several very important narratives that he's trying to tell, right? So the first 9 chapters of Divrei Hayamim, I'm warning you now, is going to be quite tedious, quite boring to say the least, to read through it. A part of me doesn't even want to read it because it's just long lists of names. This one's father, this one the sons, this one father, son, occasionally some daughters sprinkled in here and there. And it's all a genealogy. But I'm going to read it because I have read everything else verse by verse, so I think you deserve the respect. Every listener deserves the respect of actually hearing the words of Tanakh, the words of the prophets themselves, so that you can hear it's not just me giving you my version, but it's the prophets speaking themselves. That's why I call this Let the Prophets Speak. And also because they pick and choose certain things to emphasize, certain things not to emphasize, in order to tell a story. And Ezra's purpose in telling the story in the Book of Chronicles is really to explain to the people that just came back to Israel where you fit in the scheme of world history, right? This return to Israel and fulfilling this mission of rebuilding the temple, of rebuilding the Jewish presence in the land of Israel, coming back from the diaspora and rebuilding. And forgive me if this echoes much more modern history with the more recent building of the land of Israel and Jews returning to the land to rebuild a new Jewish state in the land of Israel that occurred in the most recent centuries. There are definitely similarities, but there's obviously dramatic differences as well. But it's very difficult not to feel the parallels. But Ezra is saying this because he wants them to understand their place in the scheme of history, right? They're at a time when they're distraught, they are disappointed, the morale is down, they are facing adversity, they are facing difficulty, facing poverty, facing strife, and they have this project to do, and is it worth it? Why should they do it? Where do they fit in the scheme of things? So the genealogies in the beginning are really designed mostly to say, look at your background, look at your history, this is how we got here, and to give them a sense of a tie, like you're tied to this land, you belong here, you're part of the picture here, this is your history, this is your family, this is where you come from, and to some degree also show how their history interplays with the other nations of the area, right? In other words, you came to be in a milieu, in an environment which included your cousins, your relatives, and your enemies. And this is where we come from. Now, with this background, we can start understanding it, and keep this in the back of your mind as we read the entire book. Because the entire book, after Ezra gives them the genealogy and shows them how they fit in the larger scheme of things, then he's going to recount the history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel in such a way as to teach them the lessons that Ezra feels are necessary for them to learn in order to be more successful the second time around. The first time, unfortunately, ended in disaster, and Ezra wants to teach them the lessons that they need to learn in order to be successful the second time around. With this introduction, we can go ahead and begin reading this chapter. And forgive me if I go through some of these verses quite quickly because they're just lists of names. Starting with the creation of the world and the first human being, Adam, Shet, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Yored, Chanoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noach, Shem, Cham, Vayafes. Those first four verses summarizes the people from Adam all the way down to Noah, and Shem, Cham, and Yafes, the 3 sons of Noach. Of course, it chooses the 3 sons of Noach as opposed to just one of the sons of Noach, because from Noach in the biblical scheme of history, divided into history, Noach was the one who had direct lineage from Adam, but everyone else derived of Noach. So the three main groups of families around the world. Again, remember, this is the writer Ezra of Divrei Hayamim teaching us the scheme where we fit in, where we as Israel, as Jews, fit into the picture. B'nei Yefes, Gomer, Umagog, Umadai, V'Yavan, V'Tuval, Umeshech, V'Tiras. The sons of Yefet are these people. Uvnei Gomer, and the sons of Gomer are Ashkenaz, V'Difas, V'Togarma. These all include names which ring of the nations that anyone living in the Middle East would be familiar with. All of these nations, all coming from Noach. Madai, those are the Medians, and Yavan is the Greeks, and Ashkenaz, it would be the far-flung people in Europe, which eventually came to mean Germany, but regardless of exactly where it is, that's not the point. But these are the people that they would have been familiar with, the nations they would have been familiar with. Uvnei Yavan, Elisha, V'Tarshisha, Kitim, V'Rodanim. Tarshish, probably one of the islands in the Mediterranean. B'nei Cham, the children of Cham, are Cush u'Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, Futu, Canaan, and the Canaanites. Uvnei Chosh, Tzivava, Chabilah, V'Saptov, Ramah, V'Saptucha, Uvnei Ra'amah, Sheva, Udedan, Sheva being Sheba. So these are the empires of the people, the ethnicities that they would have been familiar with. So all of these descended from Noach. V'Chush Yolad es Nimrod. Cush was the father of Nimrod. Hu heichel liyot gibar ba'aretz. Nimrod is the one that began to be a gibar, the mighty one in the land. Now this is strange because why suddenly did we veer off and not just mention names, but actually some biographical detail about Nimrod? On the one hand, it could simply be that it chose to mention this biographical detail, which obviously, by the way, is mentioned in Genesis as well. But the details of Nimrod's life are pretty scant, though. Could be just because Nimrod was a famous figure, so people knew of him, so they mentioned Nimrod and what he did. He's that Nimrod that people know. He was the powerful guy. But I think it's a little deeper, but I'm going to reserve comment until the next time, which is the only other time in this entire chapter where a small biographical detail is shared. And then I'm going to put the two together and try to give an idea as to what I think might be the reason why these two places were chosen as places where a small biographical detail is mentioned. Mitzrayim, Egypt, Yolad es Ludim, gave birth to Ludim, Yet Anomim, Yet Lehavim, Yet Naftuchim, Yet Patrusim, Yet Kasluchim, Asher Yatsu Misham, Plishtim, Yet Kaftorim. Mitzrayim gave birth to those, and from them came the Philistines. Again, those are nations that they would have been familiar with. Canaan, and Canaan, Yolad at Sidon, Bechoro v'at Chet, and gave birth to Sidon, which is Sidon, right? It's still a modern city with that name in what's currently Lebanon, right? So they would have come from there, and Chet, which for familiar with from the Bible, Vet Hayevusi, Vet Hamori, Vet Hagirgoshi, Vet Achivi, Vet Arki, Vet Asini. Most of these are people that they would have been familiar with, Canaanite peoples, Vet Arvadi, Vet Hatzimori, Vet Achamati. B'nei Shem, and now it's so that we've just focused on the children of Cham and the children of Yefet. So we get an idea of where everybody's coming from. And now we're going to start zeroing in closer on the people's history of the Jewish people. B'nei Shem, the children of Shem, were Elam v'Ashur, right? Again, Ashur, Assyria, somebody we'd be familiar with. V'Arpachshad, v'Lud, v'Aram, the Arameans, again, somebody we're familiar with, slightly closely more related to the people of Israel. V'Utz, v'Chul, v'Geter, v'Meshech. V'Arpachshad, Yolad et Sholach, v'Sholach, Yolad et Ever. Ule'ever Yulad Shnevonim, and Ever had two sons, Shemo Echad Peleg. One of them's name was Peleg, Kiviyamav Nifilgah Haaretz, because in his days the land was divided. V'Shem Achiv Yoktan, and the name of his brother was Yoktan. Now, this is the second time that I referred to a couple minutes ago, where it goes off and mentions a small biological detail. Biographical detail about the person, Peleg. So I mentioned Nimrod was a Gibar Chayil, a powerful man, and Peleg was during the time when land started being divided. I think it's not coincidental that obviously we've skipped over many biographical details about many of the people, which when we study the same genealogy in Bereshit and Genesis, lots of stories are mentioned about Noach. There's a whole story of Noah and the flood, and all these stories we skipped over, the Adam and Eve and this and that. All those stories, we didn't even mention the other children of Adam, Cain and Hevel, Cain and Abel, right? So why these two biographical details were mentioned? And I think that it's giving us a sense, those two biographical details, a Gibar, a powerful military man, and Peleg dividing up the land, gives us the sense of the origin of the many different nations that are around us and the context within which we are now living. We meaning now in the beginning of the Second Temple period at the time this is being written. And Ezra is just pointing these out because that's the thrust of everything that he's trying to teach when he mentions this genealogy. That the land divided up into places. People started fighting with each other. People started setting boundaries, dividing up nations. This is mine, this is yours, and so on and so forth, until we come to the point where Israel gets our portion, which is the land which we are settling and moving and moving back into right now. So I think that's why those two issues those are the only two biographical details mentioned in this entire chapter. This entire chapter continues on. V'yakton yoladet almodod v'yet sholef v'yet chatzar maves v'yet yorach v'yet hadoram v'yet uzol v'yet dikla v'yet abel v'yet avimoel v'yet shiva. There's Sheba v'yet Ophir v'yet Chavila v'yet Yovav kol eila b'nei Yoktan. They were all descendants of Yoktan. Shemar Pachshad Sholach. So again, let's go through those generations. There was Shem, then Arpachshad, and then Sholach, then Eber, then Peleg, then Reu, then Srug, then Nahor, then Terach, who's famous, and then Avram, who Abraham, and then Abraham, who is Abraham. Okay, so now we finally have the forefather of the Jewish people who we've been zeroing in on so far this entire time. This is the context within which we have a world of all these nations that have developed around us. And now we have Abraham, right? And Bnei Avraham, this is verse 28, Yitzchak v'Yishmael. Avraham had two sons, Yitzchak and Yishmael. So now let's talk about Yitzchak and Yishmael. So first it's going to talk about Yishmael, right? Our cousins, the Ishmaelites, right? And it's going to explain them, and then it's going to zero in on Yitzchak, little by little zeroing in closer and closer on the ultimate goal of this chapter, which is to talk about Israel. Ela told us, these are the children of the Bechor of Yishmael. Bechor Yishmael Nevayot, V'kedar V'ad Be'el Mivsam. The firstborn of Ishmael was Nevayot, and then his other sons, those other names, Mishma, Veduma, Masa, Chadad, Vetema, Yetur, Nafish, Vakedma, Elahem, B'nei Ishmael. These were the children of Ishmael. Now, Abraham had other children too. Not just Yitzchak and Ishmael. He had a concubine named Keturah, of Bnei Keturah, Pilegesh Abraham, Abraham's concubine, which is also mentioned in Genesis. Yolda at Zimran, V'yakshan, U'medan, U'midyan, V'yishbak, V'shuach, U'bnei Yakshan, Sheva, U'dedan. And his children were Sheva and Dedan. Uvnei Midyan, Ephah, Ve'ephar, V'chanoch, V'avidu, Ve'eldah, Kol Eila B'nei Keturah. So again, giving us the ancestry of the many different groups and ethnicities and ethnic groups and tribes that they would have been familiar with, that lived in the known world to the people that are reading this genealogy that Ezra is writing, and he's writing it for. So we talked about the descendants of Avram, Yishmael, and the children of Keturah, and now we're going to go focus on the main one that he's trying to get to, right? Which is verse 34. Vayoled Avraham et Yitzchak. Avram gave birth to Yitzchak. Remember, he was the other son. And Bnei Yitzchak, the sons of Yitzchak, were Esav v'Yisrael. Was Esav and Yisrael. Now, in the same pattern that he's been going, let's talk a little bit about Esav and his children, so that we can then zero in on Yisrael. And remember, it's always important to talk about the context within which the people of Israel developed. So he's talking about Esav, and then he's going to zero in on Israel. Bnei Esav, the children of Esav, are as follows: Eliphaz, Reuel, V'ush, V'yalam, V'korach. Bnei Eliphaz, Teman, V'omar, Tzvi, V'gatam, Kenaz, V'timna of Amalek. B'nei Reuel, Nachas, Zerach, Shama, Umiza, Uvnei Seir, Lotan, V'shoval, V'tzivon, Va'ana, V'dishon, V'etzer, V'dishon. I could translate all of these into English, but all they are is the sons of this one, and then a list of names, the sons of this one, a list of names, the sons of that one, a list of names. Uvnei Lotan, Chori, V'homam, them in verse 39, the children of Lotan are Chori and Homam, V'achos, Lotan, Timnah. And the sister of Lotan was Timnah. This is a very curious verse, which has its parallel in Genesis as well. Why is it important to tell me that Lotan had a sister named Timnah? Who is this Timnah? Why is she important? There's a lot of legends in Chazal, in the works of the rabbis, in the Midrashim, and in the Talmud that tell stories about this Timnah, why she was an important person. Most famous of which is that Timnah was a woman who had desired to join the Jewish people but was turned away by Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She was turned away, and then she said, well, if I can't marry one of them, I want to marry into at least the family. So she went and married into Esav's family. But regardless, for some reason she was famous, and she was mentioned here, and there's, I don't know, but it's unclear from the verse itself. So all the stories are interesting, and you can learn a lot from those stories, but just the simple pshat, the simple explanation of the verse is not 100% clear. Verse 40, B'nei Shoval, Alya, Numonachas, Ve'eval, Shviva, Onam, B'nei Tzivon, Aya, Va'ana. Those are the sons of Shoval. B'nei Ana, Dishon, B'nei Dishon, Chamron, V'eshban, V'yitron, Ucharon, B'nei Eitzer, Bilon, V'zavon, Yakon, B'nei Dishon, Utzvaron. Again, long lists of those names of the descendants of Esav. Now, because it's talking about the descendants of Esav, and now it's starting to zero in a little bit more, to tell a little bit more historical events, right? Not so much just a genealogy, starting from verse 43, because it's going to start talking about the history of the kings of Israel. Obviously, it's not going to talk about the history of the kings of every single one of the nations that are out there, right? Because obviously that would take forever, and the milieu within which the kingdom of Israel grew up, it's not important really to tell me which king was the king of Ashkenaz, right? Wherever, somewhere in remote parts of Europe, remote from from the perspective of the people reading this book when it was written. But it is important to tell about the closest nation, the nation closest to us, which is the kings of Edom, right? Which is geographically right next to the land of Israel, and it's a kingdom with which the people of Israel interacted with, and they were very closely related, closely linguistically, close culturally. We mentioned Edom many times throughout Tanakh. Edom, for the most part, was a implacable enemy of the people of Israel, although there were times when they were allies as well. Edom, the people who should have been the closest to us, but were also our biggest enemies. We mentioned them a lot. And I recommend that you go back to, let's say, the Book of Ovadia. We talked about them in detail. And the Edom, the Idumeans now, and they're also sometimes identified with, they're known later as the Idumeans. Eventually, we know that there were Idumean converts, and King Herod also came from Idumean lineage. So who eventually was a king of Israel very much later in the Second Temple period. So the relationship between Israel and Edom was a very close one. So we're just going to list the kings of Edom, because, again, this is the milieu within which the kings of Israel grew. And then we're going to focus and zero in on, in the next chapter, on the kings of Israel and the Israelite monarchy and its development. So, Ve'ela ha'melachim asher molchu be'eretz Edom. These are the kings that were kings in the land of Edom. Lifnei melach melech lifnei Israel. So they had their kingdom before the people of Israel, the children of Israel, the other son of Isaac. And remember here, it's been using the term Yisrael, not the term Yaakov, because Yisrael encompasses, all of the children of Israel, and it's the name that was chosen in the Book of Chronicles to refer to Yaakov, and Yaakov, of course, was given that name Yisrael in the Book of Genesis. So who were these people that were the kings? Bela ben Beor, V'shem Iro Dinhava, right? It sounds very remarkably similar to Bilam ben Beor. Whether it's the same person or not, probably not, based on the chronology, but it is what it is. Vayomas Bala vayimloch tachtav, and Bala died, and the king after him was Yovav ben Zerach mi Batzra. Yovav, the son of Zerach, from the town of Batzra. Vayomas Yovav died, vayimloch tachtav Chusham me'eretz Temani, and the king Chusham took over, and he was from the land of Teman. Vayomas Chusham vayimloch tachtav Hadad ben Bedad hamakeet Midyon b'stei Moav v'shem Iro Avit, and he struck. Hadad ben Bedad was the one who struck down Midian in the fields of Moab. This was an important battle that developed the geopolitical situation to which the people of Israel entered when they first came into the land of Israel. So again, another historical event, a biographical event that was important to understand the wars that were taking place and the geopolitical situation that the people came into. Vayomas Hadad vayimloch tachtav Samla mimasreka. Hadad died, and Samla mimasreka succeeded him as king. Vayomas Samla vayimloch tachtav Shaul merochovos hanar, from Rechovos on the place called Rechovot on the river. Saul from there. Vayomas Shaul, and Saul died. Vayimloch tachtav Baalchanan ben Achbar, and the one king was Baalchanan ben Achbar. Vayomas Baalchanan vayimloch tachtav Hadad v'shem Iro Pa'i v'shem Ishto, and his wife's name was Mehetavel bat Matred bat Mezahav. Why his wife was important to mention? Most likely because she must have been a significant, a well-known figure. Exactly why is unclear. Vayomas Hadad vayu alufe Edom aluftim, and Hadad died. And now among the people of Edom, they developed into many different clans or alufim here. Aluf Timna, Aluf Alva, Aluf Yetet, Aluf Aholivama, Aluf Ela, Aluf Pinon, Aluf Kenaz, Aluf Teman, Aluf Mibzar, Aluf Magdiel, Aluf Hiram, Ela, Aluf Edom. These were the clans or the tribes that made up Edom, which are important because correspondingly the Israelites were also divided into tribes, which we will mention in a minute. So this concludes chapter 1. I'm sorry, I know that it was not exactly the most exciting, but it is still very important for us to understand why Ezra felt it was important to mention this genealogy. He's trying to tell the people that are coming in, this is your lineage, this is where you come from, you belong here, right? And we're going to see him emphasizing this as we go on in the next 8 chapters, and I'm warning you now, there's going to be a lot of genealogy, but thrown in here and there are going to be some verses that continue to help us understand the purpose and point of all of this. And after the first 9 chapters, then we start getting into history. It'll be a lot more interesting, a lot more fun. But again, this is the narrative that Ezra is introducing to the people as they are trying to reestablish the second Jewish Commonwealth. And thank you so much for studying the first chapter of Chronicles and for beginning this book with me. Looking forward to studying the entire book of Chronicles and, of course, all of the books of the prophets together. Have a wonderful day.